Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my incredibly dull history series, and tonight we will learn about the history of the park bench. I don't know about you, but I've been sitting on benches for years. I have a favourite one. It's at home in Ireland, in the botanical gardens, and on it says, "For Elizabeth." She loved this place. This history of benches is, as always, a little bit dull and a little bit humorous, perhaps, so apologies in advance if you go to sleep with a smile on your face. And let me know in the comments, where's your favorite bench in the world? Okay, let's do the relaxation session first, before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface you lie upon tonight. And beneath all of that, feel the support of the earth, our home. From the earth we receive a constant support. And as you become aware of that feeling of being supported, see if you can let go a little more now. Releasing tension, letting go. A little more now. 9. Feel into your body. Where are you still holding? Where do you feel tension? Maybe you feel pain. Maybe it's in your feet, in your lower legs, in your thighs, in your belly, in your chest. Maybe you're like me, and you hold a lot of tension in your hands or in your face. See if you can let that tension go now. Just by becoming aware of it, we can ease the tension. 8. You are safe. Allow my voice to be an anchor of safety tonight, to be a friend. Know that my voice will only ever take you to safe places, and allow that fact, that feeling of trust, to enable you to let go a little more now. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts you might be having, know them for what they are, just thoughts. Don't judge them, positively or negatively. Know that they are not you. They are a symptom of being a human. And as they arrive, see them, but there's no need to follow them. Watch them go, floating away, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing through a starlit sky. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. We all do. So as you move deeper and deeper towards deep rest tonight, know this: you deserve this rest as much as anyone else. 5. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It is a constant friend. A constant presence. It's just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. See where you can find your peace tonight. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things, for this moment of peace, for the shelter you have tonight, for the breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see the humble bench as you've never seen it before, because tonight you will learn its history and maybe consider it in an entirely different way. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. And 1. Completely letting go now, as I tell you tonight's sleep story. Part 1. in which the very idea of sitting down is considered. Before we can speak of park benches, we must speak of the act of sitting down itself. There was a time, it is difficult to imagine, but true, when sitting down was done only in private, or at the very least away from view. To sit in a public place on purpose, with no business other than to rest, was once considered either lazy, suspicious, or both. And yet, human legs being what they are, the need eventually overcame the social doubt. Historians disagree on when the first true bench appeared, largely because a bench is nothing more than a surface low enough to perch on, and such surfaces appear in nearly every settlement since the beginning of time. A fallen log counts. A stone wall counts. In ancient Rome, entire forums were ringed with stone seating, which is really just a very hard park bench with a better view. What made a bench, however, was its intention. A park bench is not a piece of stone left by chance, nor a wall that happens to be low enough. It is a deliberate invitation to sit, and that, the first invitation to sit, is where this long, uneventful story truly begins. One imagines a group of early municipal planners standing in a bare field, staring at the ground and thinking, well, people will want to rest somewhere. And thus, the first bench was commissioned, probably by committee, probably with a vote, and probably over tea that was too hot to drink. It would have been simple, of course, a wooden plank, a few supports, perhaps uneven at first, but it was enough. People sat, found it satisfactory, and so the idea of the public bench took root. The field became a park. The bench stayed where it was, and very little else happened, which makes this the perfect beginning. Part 2, in which the bench finds a home in Paris. By the mid-19th century, with Paris being rebuilt under Baron Haussmann's sweeping plans, beginning in the 1850s, the idea of public benches became formalized. The new boulevards needed street furniture, lampposts, kiosks, fountains, and benches too. The architect Gabriel Daviou, employed in Haussmann's projects, is credited with designing many of the standard benches along the new squares and tree-lined boulevards. Around 1855, the city's service of promenades and plantations was established, responsible for many of the gardens, walks, and open spaces in Paris. In those early years, the park benches installed under these programs were painted in a uniform dark green to harmonize with trees and background, and were meant to be understated rather than ostentatious. Now, the benches were not just dropped randomly. Records from Paris urban planning suggest they were placed at regular intervals along the boulevards and in the squares parisiennes, or small public gardens. The first benches appear on the grand boulevards and in the public gardens that Haussmann created or reworked. A small human story. In the early 1860s, a vendor of roasted chestnuts complained to his local arrondissement council that a new bench was placed directly under the window of his chalet cart, and customers preferred to sit rather than buy. The council minutes record that he was asked politely to move his stand 2 steps left so that people could sit without interfering with his line of sight, and so the bench might truly serve the public. By 1870, public benches had become such a civic expectation in Paris that when the Paris Commune took over, one of the symbolic acts by rebels was to dismantle certain street furniture and benches in affluent districts to express ideas about public space and who owned the streets. The loss was noted in journalistic commentary at the time as one of many small but personal affronts. Thus, by the late 19th century, in Paris, the bench had shifted from an afterthought to a recognized feature of the cityscape, not just for rest, but for promenades, casual encounters, and quiet watching. Even today, many benches survive from the Haussmann era, their paint a little cracked, their wood slatted, but they offer a link to that time in history. Part 3, in which a bench arrives in 19th century New York. In 1858, when the Greensward Plan was adopted and work began on Central Park, the notion of public benches in New York was still novel. One of the early bench models mentioned in Central Park records is the Central Park settee, a simple cast iron and wood bench meant to recede into its surroundings. The settee design often used 7 slats, 5 for the seat, 2 for the back, so people would not be tempted to lie down outright, but could sit in reasonable comfort. It was pragmatic, inconspicuous, and, unsurprisingly, complained about almost immediately by some visitors for being too plain. In those early years, rustic benches also appeared in the more naturalistic corners of the park. Rough timber benches, sometimes simply branches fashioned into seats. Calvert Vaux, influenced by rustic garden design, had a hand in this. The rustic style was intentionally less formal, so the bench looked like it belonged to the trees. There are anecdotal records of early visitors grumbling that the benches were too close to paths. That was the moment someone tripped over a bench leg or felt the back scratchy in evening clothes. One letter to a New York newspaper in 1865 complained that the iron supports catch skirts when one rises too carelessly. Benches and fashion have long had a fraught relationship. By the 1870s, benches in Central Park were quietly expected. The public would not trek through fields just to rest on rocks. The park structures team noted that benches must be placed at pleasant intervals. The phrase pleasant interval is one of those Victorian euphemisms meaning not so far apart that people complain, but far enough apart that you still feel you're walking. And so, in New York, the bench became a fixture. Not dramatic, not revolutionary, but faithful. Part 4, in which the bench takes root in London. By the mid-19th century, London's parks and squares were being remade for public use. Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park, St. James's Park, smaller suburban parks. The city planners and the landowners began permitting, sometimes grudgingly, benches in these places. They had to decide wood or iron, back or no back, painted or natural. One of the early designs for cast iron benches in England owes its lineage to the foundries that in the 1830s began producing decorative ironwork. Railings, gates, furniture, The Darby family's ironworks in Colebrookdale, for example, expanded in the early 19th century to include garden furniture casting. The same techniques that made ornate gate scrolls began to trickle very slowly into seating design. In London's Battersea Park, for instance, when it was restored more recently, over 200 benches have been installed in traditional Victorian style, reviving a look likely not far from what early Londoners sat on in the late 1800s. But of course, the traditional Victorian style carefully skirts the question of how uncomfortable the earliest ones were. There is something quietly political about benches in London. A bench is permission to stop. In the densifying city, where spaces were being swallowed by buildings and traffic, benches said, "You may exist here, even if only for a moment." And so, when a new bench was placed in a square, there might be letters to the Times or to local papers complaining about vagabonds using them, people lingering too long, or even children rolling on the slats after dusk. Records are thin, but that kind of civic grousing appears regularly in local council minutes of the period. A small anecdote. In one London borough, around 1875, a committee meeting discussed whether benches in a newly opened public garden could have armrests. Some argued armrests were humane, so one might lean, while others feared they would impede the quick departure of idle loiterers. The debate lasted nearly an hour. The minutes show more ink used for that than many other garden decisions. By the 1880s, London had benches in every park square, and for many Londoners, the bench was a place to rest the feet, to open a newspaper, to nibble a biscuit, and to quietly observe. The city souls who knew the bench well would map their lives around them. "I'll meet you by the third bench in Kensington Gardens, past the rose bushes, around 3:10. And those benches heard those whispered pleas, small plans, heartbreaks, morning tobacco smokes, and the slow passing of carriage wheels. London's benches were not grand monuments. They were witnesses. They bore the weight, sometimes literally, of working men coming home, of mothers pushing prams, of old people pausing. Weather peeled their paint. Rain warped their boards, and sometimes boards cracked entirely. But repairs were made, eventually. Slats replaced, a new coat of green paint applied to blend them into the trees. And so, in London, the bench became part of the city's fabric, unremarked except when it failed to be there. In gardens, squares, promenades, they gave citizens permission to stop, to breathe, to sit. Part 5, in which the bench visits Asia. When the bench first left Europe, it travelled slowly, in imagination, in colonial maps, in urban plans. It arrived in India, not with a flourish, but as necessity. In late 19th century Bombay or Calcutta, municipal planners would sometimes call for rest seats in garden promenades and sitting slabs along walkways. These were rarely described as park benches at first. Often stone slabs or carved edges of paths that people used like benches. In Delhi's Lodi Garden, there is a bench often mentioned in travel writing, tucked under a scraggly tree. Local authors in the 20th century sometimes complain wistfully that the tree never gives shade, and the bench seems always empty at midday, as though it waits for evening. In China, the mythic coin-operated spike bench story gives writers a sharp contrast. A bench you pay for or face discomfort. While that version has been widely debunked, it remains a vivid illustration of how benches are not just restful furniture, but statements about who is allowed to linger. Over in Japan, benches in public gardens came late, because traditional design valued open mats, rock edges, or stone stools more than Western-style long benches. The first Western gardens installed in the Meiji era sometimes included benches imported or modeled on European style, but locals sometimes found them oddly long and hard, not to mention unaligned to the tea garden aesthetic. Thus, in Asia, the bench is a late visitor. When it arrives, it carries with it tensions between old forms of sitting, stones, mats, and floor, and new forms, planks and slats, between colonial influence and local adaptation, between who the bench is for and who is watched sitting on it. Part 6, in which the bench comes to Australia. In the early decades of the 20th century, Australia's cities were growing quickly, building gardens, promenades, and what they liked to call public reserves in places like Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide. Benches began to appear in parks and botanic gardens, in the quiet corners where people liked to pause between errands. Some benches were shipped in, some were made locally from Tasmanian blackwood or local eucalyptus. There is a documented example in Canberra's Commonwealth Park, which in later years has had a furniture upgrade program. While that's much later, it signals how benches became a considered element of park design rather than an afterthought. In the 1920s and 30s, as Australia's public works departments matured, benches in parks were included in the budgets. Not many, but enough to be noticed. In Hobart, Tasmania, there's St. David's Park, a heritage-listed park. While its founding was earlier, by the 20th century, it had begun to contain benches and seats among its paths. The park officially opened to the public around 1926 in its Victorian garden style, with paths, lawns, memorials, and benches in place. One small human moment. A city council minute from a small Australian town in the 1930s records that when they placed a new bench under a jacaranda tree, a local lady asked that it be set a little further back so the blossoms would not drop on people's heads. The committee agreed, but then had to reconsider when in autumn the flowers were desired as falling petals. This kind of bench bothering happens everywhere. In those years, benches in Australia often bore the scars of climate, sun bleaching, termite nibbling, twisted slats after storms. Replacement slats might come from different timber species, giving the bench a striped look, a patchwork of wood types. Local gardeners or caretakers might quietly favor one bench over another, the one under more shade, the one with a better view of the water or a fountain. Part 7, in which the bench in mid-century America has its big moment. By the time the 1930s rolled around, America had learned to take its benches very seriously indeed. It wasn't enough for a bench to merely exist. Oh no, it had to be designed. The Central Park settee, with its dignified cast-iron legs and wooden slats, was practically a social contract. Sit here, but behave yourself. It had 5 slats exactly, which some claimed was the precise number required to keep the sitter upright, but not so relaxed that they'd nod off and miss their stop on the way home. In 1939, when the World's Fair opened in New York, a brand new bench design was unveiled, as though it were the latest motor car. Officials beamed at the sleek cast iron ends and freshly painted green slats. Somewhere, one imagines, a man in a hat gave a small speech about forward-looking furniture for a forward-looking nation, which was listened to politely by several people who were really just waiting to sit down. Benches, of course, became battlegrounds for small human dramas. Housewives complained that courting couples occupied entire benches for hours at a time, while courting couples complained that housewives sat down too noisily with their shopping bags. There was even a case whispered about in Chicago in 1946, where a man spent so long feeding pigeons from his bench that the Parks Department considered naming the bench after him, only to discover his name was not quite suitable for a plaque. Down in St. Petersburg, Florida, the green bench became an institution. By the mid-century, there were thousands of them, lined up along the streets like little soldiers, waiting patiently for bottoms. Tourists would choose their bench with great ceremony, as though selecting a throne. Locals became fussy about which bench was the good one, the one with the least wobble, or the best shade at 3 p.m. And then there were the municipal conspiracies, or so it seemed. In some towns, benches mysteriously sprouted extra armrests halfway along, a sure sign that the city had decided lying down was getting out of hand. Young men retaliated by balancing themselves sideways across the armrest like gymnasts, just to prove it could be done. The police pretended not to notice, because secretly they found it quite funny. Mid-century benches were also at the mercy of materials. Some were made of wood so soft it splintered under the lightest touch, so that by July the benches were full of tiny summer stories etched into shins and backsides. Others were made of iron that got so hot in August that the first sitter of the day had to leap up with a hiss, leaving the bench to cool for the next brave soul. And yet, people adored them. They were gathering spots, gossip posts, chessboard tables, and lunch break chapels. If you wanted to know what was really going on in a town, you only had to sit quietly on a bench for an hour and listen. The benches heard everything. Whispered promises, loud arguments, business deals, and at least one botched marriage proposal where the ring fell through the slats and was only recovered by a boy with particularly thin arms. Mid-century benches didn't just hold up human bodies. They held up entire afternoons. They were there for the war widows waiting for letters, for the post-war picnickers unpacking their flasks, for the school children licking ice creams too slowly. A bench could be occupied by 3 strangers who pretended not to notice one another, or by one person who sat right in the middle, thereby owning it completely. By the 1950s, the bench had become the quiet backbone of public space. Never in the headlines, never given a medal, but always there. If it creaked or leaned slightly, no one minded. It was doing its job, the same as it had yesterday, the same as it would tomorrow. Part 8, in which London's benches soldier on. London's benches of the late 1940s were stoic creatures. They had survived the Blitz, some scorched, some splintered, some simply gone missing altogether. It is not known who stole an entire bench in Clapham Common during the blackout, but one suspects it was reassembled indoors. Those that remained bore shrapnel scars, like badges of honor. Children would trace the tiny pits in the wood and invent stories about them, usually involving heroics far greater than the bench itself had probably experienced. Paint was scarce, so many benches were left with flaking coats, giving sitters a sort of commemorative souvenir on their trousers. Municipal workers would eventually repaint them, usually with whatever paint was left over from other projects. Thus, you might find 3 benches in a row, one dark green, one brownish green, and one an alarming shade of grey that had previously been meant for a public lavatory door. Londoners took to the benches again as soon as it was allowed. They were tired of queues, tired of ration books, tired of standing in shelters. A bench in Regent's Park became the unofficial meeting place for war widows to exchange the day's news, and another in Hyde Park was supposedly occupied every morning at 9 sharp by a man with an empty bird cage, for reasons no one ever got to the bottom of. There were complaints, of course. There were always complaints. Benches were said to be too wet, too far apart, too close together, too in shadow, or too in draft. One borough council meeting in 1948 debated moving a bench 3 feet to the left so that it would face the morning sun, only to move it back again when residents declared the afternoon glare intolerable. Still, Londoners loved their benches. They were the first places where the city sat down together after the war, quietly exhaling. The benches listened, as they always had, to confessions, job offers, plans for emigration, quiet tears, first kisses. If you asked them, they would have said it was good to be useful again. Part 9, in which Paris repaints its benches again and again. In Paris, post-war benches received a fresh coat of the classic Parisian green, though the paint crews often seemed to have only enough for the first half of each slat. There are photographs from the late 1940s showing benches with 2 glossy boards and 3 still dull, which gave the impression that they had been dressed halfway for a party and then changed their mind. Parisians returned to their benches with renewed enthusiasm after the war, treating them as miniature salons. Lovers sat scandalously close. Students debated philosophy, and the occasional solitary poet sat in the exact center, ensuring no one else dared join them. The benches often paired with chestnut trees, which dropped their leaves and conkers with perfect aim upon the heads of unsuspecting sitters. By the 1950s, benches had become such a part of Parisian life that guidebooks would note the best ones. For a quiet moment, choose the bench near the 3rd lamppost on the left, facing the fountain. Tourists would obediently hunt for these benches, only to find them already occupied by a man smoking and glaring at them for disturbing his peace. The benches developed personalities. The one in Place des Vosges was famously unfriendly, its slats always slightly damp, no matter the weather. The benches along the Seine, meanwhile, were known to attract students with guitars who played exactly 3 chords before giving up and kissing someone instead. If you wanted to see Paris wake up, you could sit on a bench at dawn and watch the whole city stretch. You'd see milk carts, sleepy dogs, and cafe chairs being dragged out onto pavements. By midday, the bench would be warm enough to put you to sleep, which was exactly when the park guards appeared to remind you that benches were for sitting, not napping, a rule more honored in the breach than the observance. Part 10, in which Berlin gets new benches among the rubble. Berlin's benches after 1945 were a mixed lot. Some were bombed out entirely, leaving just the cast iron ends like mournful punctuation marks on empty lawns. Others had been burned for firewood during the bitter winter of 1946, leaving gaps in the city's seating plan. When new benches were finally installed in the late 1940s, they were sturdy to the point of stubbornness, as though Berlin had decided that never again would a mere bomb be allowed to inconvenience its park furniture. These new benches were heavy, practical, and just slightly overbuilt. The sort of benches you could imagine surviving the next 3 centuries. They were painted a sober dark color, sometimes grey, sometimes brown, and occasionally a green so dark it looked black after rain. Berliners did not seem to mind. They were simply glad to have somewhere to sit and smoke and argue politics again. One legend from the Tiergarten claims that the first new bench installed after the war was immediately christened with a bottle of schnapps by a group of students, who then sat in perfect silence for a full hour, as though giving thanks. Of course, there were quirks. Some benches were bolted down in slightly crooked fashion, because the ground itself was still uneven. This led to one end of the bench being marginally lower than the other, which caused friends to slide imperceptibly toward one another during conversation. Many a romance was born this way, or so the benches liked to think. By the 1950s, Berlin's parks had regained their rhythm. People sat, nodded to one another, read newspapers with enormous headlines, and occasionally stared into the distance, just allowing themselves to be. Part 11, in which New York learns to put its name on things. By the 1960s, New York benches had been through a lot. Depression, war, pigeons, and they were beginning to look it. The city's answer was not subtle. Slap on a new coat of paint and hope for the best. Whole crews were dispatched to Central Park to repaint thousands of slats at once, leaving a faint smell of green gloss that hung over them all for days. The paint inevitably found its way onto coats, handbags, and one unlucky poodle who leaned too closely against a bench and emerged with stripes. It was around this time that New Yorkers began to feel possessive about their benches. In the 1970s, when the city was broke and the park falling apart, citizens started talking about saving the benches. Committees were formed, meetings were held, some benches were adopted informally, claimed by certain dog walkers, chess players, and eccentrics. There was one man who arrived at the same bench at the same hour every day and sat there for precisely 23 minutes. If someone got there first, he would stand nearby and wait, glaring gently until they left. By 1986, the Central Park Conservancy formalized the whole thing with the Adopt a Bench program. For a fee, you could have a little plaque bolted to your chosen seat. Over the years, these plaques became mini novels. In memory of Harvey, he sat here a lot. Or for Ellie, who loved pretzels. By the 1990s, there were thousands of them, each a tiny piece of New York history, which meant that if you sat too long, you might eventually know the entire genealogical history of Manhattan by heart. Part 12, in which London experiments, sometimes disastrously. Meanwhile, in London, the 1960s brought an urge to modernize. Someone on a council somewhere decided that the old wooden benches were far too old-fashioned, and out came the concrete seating. These were sturdy, yes, and could not be stolen, not without a crane, but they had the aesthetic charm of a bus shelter and the comfort of a slab at the mortuary. Londoners sat on them anyway, grumbling, because they were British and that's what one does. By the 1980s, new designs were being trialled. Metal benches that were sleek, stylish, and almost guaranteed to scorch the backs of your thighs in summer. One borough experimented with brightly painted fiberglass benches, which quickly faded to a shade best described as sad pastel. This was also the golden age of the anti-sleep armrest. Councils, worried about rough sleepers, began adding little metal bars halfway along the bench to stop anyone lying down. This worked beautifully, except that it also prevented anyone from sitting too close together, resulting in entire rows of couples sitting like awkward teenagers at a school dance. Still, London benches soldiered on. They heard the rise of punk music, the chatter of Carnaby Street, the long political arguments of students with very long scarves. In Hyde Park, the speakers' corner benches became unofficial debate halls where arguments were finished, long after the soap boxes were packed away. Part 13, in which Paris gets restless. Parisian benches in the late 1960s had front row seats to history. In May 1968, as students occupied the streets, benches were sometimes turned into barricades or simply used as soap boxes, proving that a bench, if provoked, can be revolutionary. After the protests, the benches were returned to their usual positions, a little scratched, a little more worldly, but still green. In the 1970s, Paris toyed with the idea of modern benches, sleek metal frames, concrete bases. Parisians did what they do best. They complained, poetically. There were letters in Le Monde arguing that the new benches were too cold, too impersonal, that they made one feel like an administrative file waiting to be stamped. By the 1980s, many of these modern benches were quietly removed, replaced by the old-style green ones. The people had won, and the benches were back in fashion. By now, the benches had learned a trick. They were not just furniture, they were stages. Lovers staged dramatic breakups on them. Philosophers staged endless debates on them. Painters staged themselves nearby, hoping to be noticed. The benches tolerated it all, never once rolling their eyes, even when the guitar-playing youths mangled La Vie en Rose for the 15th time that afternoon. Part 14, in which the bench enters the modern age and sits down for a well-earned rest. The modern bench, in many ways, is wiser than all its ancestors. It has seen centuries of bottoms, boots, umbrellas, sandwiches, pigeons, proclamations, naps, and novels, and yet it has never once got up and walked away. Today's bench knows its purpose, to be there when it is needed, and to be invisible when it is not. Modern materials have given it new skins. You find them in treated hardwood, recycled plastic, brushed steel, even concrete polished so smooth it looks almost kind. Designers insist their benches are ergonomic, which means they are supposed to match the curve of the human spine, though many still leave you with the faint suspicion you've been tricked into good posture against your will. Many of today's benches have plaques, dedications to lovers, parents, dogs, teachers, and at least one to a man who never liked sitting down, but we put this here anyway. These plaques have turned benches into little time capsules. You sit, you read, and suddenly you were imagining someone named Dorothy who liked to watch the swans in this very spot 50 years ago. Benches now also find themselves in the grip of technology. Some are smart benches with USB chargers and solar panels, so that you can both rest and charge your phone, thereby ensuring you never have to look up from a screen to enjoy the view. The benches don't mind. They have been ignored for years. But one suspects they miss the old days, when people simply sat and stared into space for half an hour. In cities, benches are often placed with military precision, exactly so many meters apart, facing a carefully planned view. In smaller towns, they appear in more eccentric places, halfway up a hill for no reason, on a corner where nobody goes, or right outside a bakery, so that you can sit with a bun and judge who's getting the last custard tart. Modern benches also play host to an endless parade of characters. There's the jogger, stretching one leg against the backrest, the tourist, resting with a guidebook, the teenager, sitting cross-legged on the top slat, because the normal way is too obvious. There's the elderly couple, who always sit on the same bench every Sunday, and tut at anyone who dares to take their place. Some benches have become shrines to ritual. The morning coffee bench, the "I phone my sister here" bench, the "I eat my disappointing sandwich here because the view is better than the sandwich" bench. If you sat long enough, you'd start to recognize the regulars. The man with the crossword, the lady with the shopping trolley, the child who insists on jumping off the armrest, even though they are told not to every single week. Even the complaints have evolved. People now post online about the benches being too hot, too cold, too hard, too few, too many. Photos of bad benches go viral. Crooked ones, benches placed 6 inches from a wall, benches that face a bin. The benches, if they could speak, would probably sigh and say, "At least you're still talking about us." Yet despite all the change, the heart of the bench remains unchanged. It is still the simplest possible invitation. Sit here if you like. You can read a book, or cry quietly, or wait for someone, or do nothing at all. No ticket required, no password needed. And perhaps that is why benches endure. They are democracy in wood and metal, little equalizers where a banker and a busker might share the same slat for 5 minutes, both staring at the same pigeons. The bench doesn't care who you are. It just offers you the view. As evening comes, the modern bench glows faintly in the last light, its paint a little scuffed. One slat may be loose, but still sound. People will come tomorrow, and the day after. They will sit, talk, sigh, laugh, feed crumbs to birds, leave small marks with their lives. The bench will keep still, patient as ever. And so we end where we began, with a simple seat, waiting. The bench has traveled the world, survived centuries of weather, war, arguments, and lovers. It has been painted, scraped, moved, stolen, repaired, mourned, and celebrated. And tonight, as you walk past, you might just stop, sit down, and let it hold you for a while, the way benches have been holding people, very quietly, all along.